BBC, this is Frank Gillard here, recording just outside Scilly, a mile or two back from Scilly, on Friday morning, June the 16th, during a barrage which is being laid down to prepare the way for an infantry attack.
The reports by Frank Gillard in France, Richard Dimbleby over Berlin, and dispatches by other members of the BBC's war reporting unit gave BBC Radio News a reputation for professionalism and integrity unrivaled by any other broadcasting organisation.
The bombers of the main force are now streaming in above and below us. As we drive steadily over Cologne in a dead level straight line, the German flak is winking and flashing.
These films, by the way, of the correspondents in action, were made for the cinema audiences of the day. But even without the pictures, the reports and the radio bulletins that went with them were dramatic enough.
The BBC Home and Forces programme. This is Bruce Belfridge.
By the end of the war, 10, 12 million people at a time were tuning in their radios at 9 o'clock, almost as a matter of course. The television newsreel began in 1948, pretty much on the lines of the cinema newsreel, and the programme was an instant success with the viewers.
In Paris, they're now displaying the autumn fashions. Jack in the Box is apparently out of date, and Jill in the Box appears to show us the latest designs in women's hats.
So long as it stuck to entertainment, the programme, which was totally under the control of the television service, was safe from the attentions of the BBC's editorial chiefs at Broadcasting House. But within a couple of years, the people running the newsreel started to put in more and more topical material, often very topical. Stories that came perilously close to news coverage.
On Monday morning, television made history by transmitting pictures for the first time from within the precincts of number 10 Downing Street. The occasion was the first of the current meetings of the Dominion Prime Ministers.
It was the start of several years of often bitter argument between the television service and the guardians of the BBC's news reputation at BH, as the headquarters of Sound Radio is called. Basically, the problem was that the pictures of current events were supplied and controlled by the television service. The editorial responsibility for the coverage was claimed by radio's news division at Broadcasting House.
Went exactly to its custom.
The deadlock continued until in 1953, two developments forced everyone to rethink their positions. The televising of the Queen's coronation was a triumph. The day-long coverage was hailed as superb, and Richard Dimbleby's commentary as a masterpiece.
The Queen returns toward her chair of estate. There will follow the first part of the taking of the coronation oath, an oath which binds Her Majesty to the service of her peoples and to the maintenance of the laws of God.
The proceedings were watched by millions, some round at their neighbours, some on borrowed sets, and it finally convinced a lot of people that television was worth having. Sales of sets rocketed. But more than that, here was proof of an appetite to see what was happening in the world as well as to hear about it. But at just about the same time as the successful coverage of the coronation, there was another, even more compelling pressure on the BBC to find a way of resolving its internal difficulties. A rival commercial television network was soon to be launched, and on it, plans for a fully fledged television news service.
Dubbing deck ready. Stand by, Graham. So over this wall now to the ITN studio, and your newscaster tonight is Christopher Chataway. Q Grams. Cameron 1. Stand by to Q Chris. Coming to 2. Q Chris. Good evening.
For the BBC, the arrival of ITN on September the 22nd, 1955, was something of a cultural shock. For a start, it tried to be a programme, not an illustrated radio news bulletin. And it horrified critics at Broadcasting House by doing precisely what BBC News had so studiously avoided. It personalised the newsreader, or newscaster, as Robin Day and Christopher Chataway were called. Robin Day in particular had a lack of deference in his interviewing technique that was quite outside the BBC's approach to this kind of thing.
In his garden, in his house in Cairo, here is President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. This is a British packet of ball bearings, and this is an almost identical packet of ball bearings made in Japan, a deliberate copy. What do you have to say about that?
I think this is out of order.
What does the Foreign Minister have to say about it? That was my question to the Foreign Minister.
Yes, the Foreign Minister will need time to answer this kind of question. If you have this in mind, you should have given him advance knowledge.
You didn't ask for advance knowledge of any questions whatever.
Of course we don't, because we didn't expect you were so treacherous.
You think this is treachery to show you these packets?
Yes, this courtesy.
By the middle of the 50s, largely in response to the arrival of ITN, the BBC was beginning to get its television news operation together, helped in 1956 by two stories that put it firmly on the map. The British paratroop drop into Egypt, part of the plan to recapture the Suez Canal, divided the nation. The government of the day regarded the events as a declaration of war and insisted that the BBC should therefore give it total support. But the BBC, despite threats of a government takeover, allowed the opposition the right of reply. This, more than anything else at the time, reinforced the BBC's political independence. And the other big story of the time, the Hungarian revolt and Russian measures to contain it, finally established television news as compulsive and necessary viewing. The only thing holding it back now was the lack of technology. But towards the end of the 50s, even that began to change. The new 16mm lightweight camera with magnetic soundtrack gave much greater flexibility to the kind of coverage crews could get. The role of the television reporter was developing. Someone who went out with a camera crew to note what was filmed, shape it, and write words to go with it. Outside broadcasts and the BBC's regional networks were also beginning to contribute.
5 seconds to go. We in television are convinced that the ability to portray immediacy, to realize what's new, what's going on, is the true significance of this new communications bridge.
Satellites provided the kind of facility that enabled not just millions, but hundreds of millions of people to share in the emotion of a single event, demonstrated most vividly at the funeral of President Kennedy in Washington in 1963. By now, the bulletins had come a long way from the original concept of a simple, illustrated summary of the news. They brought a dimension to world news that radio could never match.
The bombing pause in the Vietnam War is over. In a broadcast last night, President Johnson said that all American peace moves had been rebuffed and that he had ordered the resumption of air attacks on supply lines in North Vietnam. Our correspondent Anthony Lawrence reports from Saigon.
Targets were along the east coast. Naval pilots reported knocking out a bridge and damaging the approaches to a ferry landing not far from the town of Dong Hoi.
The Vietnam War was the big story now, and with the increasing sophistication of coverage, particularly foreign news coverage, the talk now was about how to make most use of the great increase in the amount of footage coming in from all over the world. More time, longer news programs was now a growing demand. ITN had been arguing the case for some time. But the BBC was first on the air with a full half-hour news program.
Good evening. And tonight, in France, 0 hour is 8 o'clock.
It was on Channel 2 at 7:30, and within a few weeks, in colour. The year was 1968, a year that was soon to justify the demands for the longer news format with a series of big stories.
Into the early hours of this morning. It started as a protest against the government's ban on the return to France of the student leader Cohn-Bendit. But with the first tear gas bombs from the riot police, the stage was set for a battle with all the violence of the first Paris student rebellion 2 weeks ago.
At home in 1968, the big running story of the year was also a series of huge demonstrations, in this case against the war in Vietnam. The way television news covered the demonstrations, even the fact that it covered them at all, led some to protest that it was only encouraging more of the same. It was the first sign that the messenger was being blamed for spreading the message, but the full force of that criticism was reserved for the next decade. The Grosvenor Square demonstrations were the last big stories covered by television news from Alexandra Palace. The old place had seen tremendous changes in the way the public were kept in touch with what was going on in the world. For 15 years, the men and women who'd worked at the palace had been preoccupied with getting a television news formula that would inform and attract the viewers. They'd been absorbed in the technicalities of the medium. It had all been great fun. And when Robert Dougal and I sang our farewells at the close-down party in September 1969, it was with genuine affection for the place and the people we'd worked with. The end of an era.
Now is the time to say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Now is the time to yield a sigh.
Yield it. Yield it.
Now the old news is going gay and joining showbiz down White City way.